This is Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network. Hey, we're back on Hello Brain. I'm Collin Adams. I've got Dr. Ramona von Leden and Dr. Dan O'Brien here with me. In part one, we talked about what's happening in the brain as we age. Today, we're shifting the conversation into what we can do about it. We'll cover how to slow cognitive decline, lifestyle strategies for brain longevity, and then some early interventions and brain training for your brain as you age. So, Dr. Dan, I'll start this conversation with you. If someone came to you and said, I want my brain to feel as sharp at 60 as it does at 30, where might you start?
Great question, Colin. I think that according to the research, there's been a lot of data around this importance of neuroinflammation, right? So I think what I would start is I would certainly understand, I talked to the patient a little bit about that pathway, just how important the research is going around neuroinflammation and ways that we can reduce that. I think like we've talked about before is the fact, how do we keep our brains sharp through exercise, through the mitochondrial function, mitochondrial density? How do we keep that up, right? How do we keep that energy source through the ATP to create that brain health, to create that cardiovascular, to create that metabolic health too? So I think through ways of exercise, I think through the diet, the Mediterranean diet, I've always been a big advocate of, because of just of the processed foods that people are consuming now that's so bad for you, and what's that doing to overall brain health and aging is becoming, again, it's been a hot topic for a while, but I think we're doing a deeper dive into nutrition, into these various diets. Also, too, getting rid of some of these toxins through intermittent fasting. I am a huge believer of intermittent fasting. Again, taking time, maybe not having breakfast in the morning, maybe going right into lunch at say noon or so, then not eating past 6 o'clock. So I think the intermittent fasting is a great way to, it's a very understand that the root cause, a very holistic way to lose weight without having to take many various therapies that we know about now. So I think that's a really good avenue to go. But again, still back to the basics, Colin, with the exercise, with the diet. I know Ramona is a big believer of the deep sleep and what that can do to clean out some of the garbage too in your brain. I think are just wonderful ways that we can do to have that sustainable, healthy brain.
Okay, so I think to line up with Dr. Dan, in my mind, there's 4 things that you can do at 30 to prepare yourself for 60. It's support energy, it's the blood flow, it's stimulation, and recovery. And each of those kind of factors into some things that Dr. Dan mentioned. But, for energy or metabolic health, we want to really focus on supporting mitochondrial function, glucose metabolism, and your insulin sensitivity. Again, we talked about this on the last episode. You see a dip in metabolic activity in the brain as you age. So if you can really focus on supporting those, it really makes a difference. In fact, early in Alzheimer's disease, you see glucose hypometabolism. That's why it's now being called like the type 3 diabetes, because you actually see this change in how the cells of the brain are taking up fuel. And so there's different diets that can approach that differently, whether, it's a intermittent fasting or whether you look at some of these alternative diets. Like I know, Collin, when we were prepping for this podcast, you were talking about things like the Bredesen or the sort of ketone diets. I don't necessarily think that there's one diet that's better than the other. I think you have to figure out with your body and your sort of metabolism what makes you feel the best. But all of them being factored into how do you provide enough metabolic support and energy so that your mitochondria can function at their highest potential. And that factors into blood flow, cerebral perfusion, or sort of the different elements in your brain that are getting more energy. Like the blood brings all the nutrients to your brain. So you need things like aerobic exercise, type 2, even just walking, something that keeps the oxygenation of the cells. That's very simply like that's how our cells stay happy and alive. Again, stimulation, thinking things like synaptic plasticity, your long-term potentiation, or your novelty, your neuroplasticity that I spoke about last time is continuing to challenge yourself, continuing to change. All of those things are going to support you having a healthy age older. And then finally, of course, sleep. We've talked about that, though. I'm a big proponent.
It's interesting, that it's really interesting in regards to sleep too. One thing I think that people kind of forget about is I want to bring this to the attention of our audience is when people come in with hypertension, right? Oftentimes physicians will just say, here's a couple therapies, we're going to follow the guidelines. We're going to put people on, on that. We're not looking at sleep apnea, obstructive, sleep apnea, central sleep apnea, all that close enough, right? Anytime someone comes in with hypertension, you got to say, are they hyperinsulinemia? Or tell me more about your sleep schedule. What is going on with that circadian alignment that I think is really crucial, rather than just say, we're just going to put all these medical therapies on this patient for hypertension. We know blood pressure fluctuates, but we're not looking at, I think, as a medical community, enough at the sleep aspect and the circadian alignment to things tied into blood pressure. And we're just putting patients on medical therapy to follow guidelines to do that without looking again at that deep-rooted cause of what actually is occurring at that cellular or molecular level.
Yeah, Dr. Dan, I think that's really important. I think, if you look at sleep, it's not just the number of hours you're doing it, it's the quality of sleep, which we discussed in our sleep episodes. And somebody might be sleeping 8 hours a night, but if they have sleep apnea, like how high quality is it? Is their sleep apnea machine or whatever they are doing to try to counter it, is it actually working for them? Like, these factor in such a huge way to their ability to clear out waste from their brain and body, their ability to consolidate memories, their ability to rewire and network and sort of process everything that you need to process. And the fact is that sleep changes as you age, just like everything does. And there's more, people see more problems with their sleep and with sleep quality in age, not just with duration.
So I really like that both of you took that in the direction of things that everyone can do, because one of my favorite things about being a health coach for the last several years has been the uniqueness of each person and how each person's journey towards whatever their best hope is for their health is like putting together a brand new puzzle. And whether that's, this is the thing that worked for them, or maybe working on heart-brain coherence worked. One person I was working with was, hoping to lose about 15 to 20 pounds and was doing all the right things, was really managing the stress well, was exercising, everything that you would think would produce that kind of result. And then through some more personalized testing, found out that this person had a very unique allergic reaction to egg, and they were eating egg every day for breakfast. And so as soon as the doctor took eggs out of the nutrition program, like boom, just like that, those 15 to 20 pounds came off in a really healthy way. But that's kind of the things that often get missed, when we do all of these things that seem to be the right thing to do lifestyle wise. And so it's always interesting. And one thing I'll just add to this conversation is it's so important to know where you're starting from. And that's why I asked the question, where would you start? I would say, from my experience, testing, both cognitive testing and more holistic health testing, is so crucial, because if you don't have your specific roadmap for where you're starting, you don't really know where to go based on what you need, not necessarily what the internet or other people are saying. But at the same time, like both of you touched on, there are things that everyone can be doing. And one of those things, blood flow and oxygenation, like Ramona said, that's how you're really keeping the brain nice and happy and smiling and bouncy, if we go back to our episode on neuroplasticity. Dr. Dan, I'll ask you this question. How trainable is the brain as we age? Like, what actually works and what's maybe more of a myth?
Absolutely, Collin. I think the brain is incredibly dynamic and it's very trainable, right? I think it's almost the old adage, right? Garbage in, garbage out. I think the more positive input that we put in, the more we can form those neuronal connections and those synapses, right, that we learn about in neuroscience. And the more we get those and expand those, that just creates better outcomes. So it's always in a process of rejuvenating, of creating those neural connections, which is really exciting. I think it's what makes the brain so fascinating. It's what makes this podcast incredible. There's been so much talk on over the years, kidney health, heart health. But what about brain? We know it's kidney goes first, then heart, then eventually the brain. And now we're really doing a deep dive into brain health. And this is a huge untapped, unmet need in medicine. And this is just an exciting time in brain health to be able to look at sustainable ways to keep our brain active.
Yeah, and I'll say, to kind of back that up, I think the old adage of like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm sorry, excuse my French, bullshit. You can continue to learn. You can continue to grow and change and keep making your brain more exciting and interesting. There's very little that you cannot continue to train and develop with age. That's not really again, for me, it's less about what you can or can't train cognitively. It's, do you have the support that your body needs? Just like if you were to go work out, do you have do you take your electrolyte supplement? Do you have, your creatine, whatever it is, but something that gives you the boost that you need so that you can handle that training. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the cognitive testing. I think that's something that, as Dr. Dan spoke about, knowing these other organs, when you go in for your physical, you get blood labs usually, and you do some pretty standard markers. And I mentioned it in the last episode about like how hormones can play into this too. I know for myself, I had that experience where a lot of times these changes that we have in our life as we age, they happen so gradually that you wouldn't necessarily notice them until you literally feel terrible. And so those blood labs and those markers that we look at, you might be thinking, oh, it's my glucose and my blood sugar and things like that. You might not be thinking about how that impacts how you feel cognitively as well. And there's certainly cognitive testing, and you and I have certainly talked to Collin offline and in some of our upcoming interviews about how we wish that cognitive testing was a part of like a normal annual physical as well. Because I think, why are we ignoring brain health, and why aren't we setting a baseline from a younger age so that you know what to compare back to? But I think you can take with your blood labs, and you can take with the data that you already have, and you can start to figure out what's making you feel good or bad. As I said, my personal experience in this, I didn't really think I felt pretty tired at one point in my like early 30s, and I thought that was just normal. I was working a lot, I was active. I'd get tired. And then I had blood labs done, and it was like my glucose was fine, my cholesterol was great, all the kind of basic markers, but my thyroid was low. And I was like, oh, and then, we corrected that. And all of a sudden I was like, I'm not falling asleep in the afternoon anymore. But I didn't know how bad I felt until it was fixed. And I think that's something where working with your physicians and working with your doctors, taking a lot of ownership in your own health is probably the most important thing that someone can do to support their healthy aging.
Yeah, it's really the neck up. We just forget about it. Like, we go into the doctor for something with our stomach or our heart, or like Dr. Dan has talked about, kidneys or whatever it might be. And for whatever reason, we just cut that off right here. Like, the brain doesn't exist in relation to those things. And,
right.
Whether it's the heart or the gut is sending 9 signals to the brain for every 1 signal the brain's sending to the gut. The heart is sending multiple signals to the brain for every signal the brain is sending to the heart. So these systems obviously are all communicating together. And to kind of come back to the topic of this segment with the brain being trainable, most of my experience with neurotech is in neurofeedback, and what's been so cool for me to see over time is whether it was a 6-year-old that I was working with running acute EEG and then training sessions, or it was someone who was in their 70s, there was always a picture, evidence of they had this brain at the beginning, we did this protocol and this training, and then they had this brain when the protocol ended. And it's just so cool to show, on a screen, instead of just imagining it, that your brain really can change itself no matter what age you are.
Yeah, Collin, I want to kind of come back to that too. I think when you're talking about the neck up, I think there's this element of, oh no, now I lost it. Dang it. My processing slowed. I'm getting old.
I'll jump in really quick. Within regards to,
please, Dr. Dan, I'll think of my thought while you jump in.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Hey, just one thing. As far as inflammation, though, too, I know it's a hot topic. You're talking about chemistries and patients' labs. Looking at that C-reactive protein and the interleukin-6, too. I'm really focused in on those two things to see where are the inflammatory markers at. Do we have inflammation somewhere in the body? Because that is driving a lot of things. There was books and articles written, I know, 10 years ago on this. But this is still coming to the forefront, especially now there's interleukin-6, right? How interleukin-6 and C-reactive proteins, how all these inflammatory markers are really playing a part. But I think then we have to look at that a little bit more carefully as we look at inflammation with the brain, as we look at neuroinflammation. Like we talked about causes of that with Alzheimer's, but there's so much research now and data around this neuroinflammation. And I think, Collin, you're right. I mean, there's inflammation in the gut, there's inflammation in the heart, everywhere, right? We have inflammation. So it's a big topic in medicine. I think it goes back to the brain and how can we prevent some of the neuroinflammation from happening, and how do we catch all this a lot earlier to provide, as I like to say, the sequela of healthcare events and complications down the road. Is catching things more upstream before downstream things happen.
Well, yeah, and Dr. Dan, I can't remember if we talked about this on the podcast or not, but this is literally what I did my PhD on, was inflammation in age and how it impacts your ability to recover from a nervous system trauma. The nervous system specifically, as you've kind of spoken to, is unique in inflammation because we actually have a higher ratio of inflammatory cells to neurons in the nervous system than we do in other parts of our body. So if you have neuroinflammation that's starting to get a bit out of control, it's much more detrimental than it might be in another part of your body. What happens as we age, we've talked about, you have some reduction in your metabolic capacity. You have some reduction in your antioxidants in your body. And antioxidants are a huge part of how we control inflammation. So that's why you start to see this very low level of neuroinflammation in aging that kind of just hanging out there. And the cells in the brain, the microglia, actually start to take on a different shape. They're kind of chilling out until there's a problem, and then they come in and they get really active and angry and inflamed, and they clean out the system, and then they go back to being calm. But in aged brain, you'll actually see that those cells are actually sort of primed. So they're always a little bit angry. They're just kind of like irritated all the time. And so if there is some kind of disruption, if there is some kind of change, they overreact and often like basically overcompensate. And have a bigger inflammatory response that turns into a chronic inflammatory response rather than what would be normal and healthy for the body. Because I think that's one thing, is we hear inflammation and we always think it's bad. Inflammation serves a very important purpose in our bodies. It helps us to repair, recover when there is a trauma. The problem is when it hangs out too long. And that's where what you put into your body and how you support it is going to help to prevent neuroinflammation from getting out of control when you're older and you have this like low level of inflammation already. I did remember what I wanted to say. So I was going to say, one thing that we have to remember with the nervous system and sort of speaking to the brain from the head up, as you mentioned, Collin, is the nervous system is entirely an input-based system. Right? It's not doing anything. It's taking information in and then responding in kind. So whatever we're putting into it, whether that's, through our hormones, through our diet, through everything, all of that information is going into the brain, and then the brain has to decide how to respond to it. And I think that's one reason why, as you said, it's like we forget about it's there because it's the observer. It's constantly taking information. But at the same time, like, it is so important that what we are providing it for inputs is supporting it to be healthy, active, etc.
We definitely need to get some observing the observer inception action going on with ourselves, making sure that we're always tuning in to what's happening in our brain. I just want to take this conversation in a different direction really quickly. This wasn't in the original plan, but I think we would be remiss to talk about cognitive aging and not talk about the APO4E or the APOE4 gene that some people have that's very closely associated with the potential for developing Alzheimer's and dementia as people age. I know several people who have even a double copy of the APOE4 gene. There's a lot of letters in there. But even with that genetic disposition, there are still things that people can do to stave that off and to essentially turn off that gene manifestation. So I would love for you guys to both really just like turn on that PhD brain that you both have and hear from your perspective some of the things that you're hearing about that gene, about that genetic predisposition, and then even for people who might be listening who have that and are aware of it, give them some hope, maybe.
I would say, so first of all, let's for the listener who doesn't necessarily know what they've heard of APOE4, but they don't really know what it is. The ApoE4 gene is a genetic variation that increases your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, granted, this is late onset Alzheimer's. We're not talking early onset. It's not like you're increased risk of something happening sooner, but it does indicate that you're more likely to develop it. This kind of ties into what we've talked about. What ApoE4 does is it causes a buildup of fat in brain cells. So it's actually, again, it's coming back to lipid metabolism in this place. And that causes a higher amyloid plaque buildup in the brain over time. Dan,
yeah, no, great. Yeah, no, that's really a fascinating thing. And, Collin, you're right. I mean, with the ApoE4, certainly a lot of studies around that. And I always look at, which is really important, it's talked about often, is this immune system, right? The immune system immune resilience, right? And as we look at the immune system too, I think what happens is something triggers it. Some sort of stressor can trigger your immune system and kind of throw it off whack. And that's, I think, when you start seeing an expression of some of these genes like ApoE4 or maybe a potential cancerous gene as well that kind of pops up. It's through the immunology, through the immune system. How do we identify ways to keep that up? And again, through the brain health, through sleep, the various things we can do to always keep our immune system as high as possible, because once that gets activated and it's where our immune system is in a difficult place, it's not able to do its functional job. And I think that's a mutation start. It could be a stressor. Stress has incredible things to the body. It could be something that happened or something along the line or habits you've been building, bad habits you've been building all along that creates that trigger. Then again, now you have that gene being expressed at a molecular level. And then again, just the sugar and the alcohol can then feed on that. And then we have, especially with cancer, right? We have kind of an increase in cells continue to divide everywhere based on the sugar and alcohol intake that can cause those issues. But back to the brain health, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of fascinating things around Alzheimer's with that gene defect. And I think there's gene therapies out there that's been really prominent, I think, to look at too. So certainly things are on the horizon as we look at therapeutic ways, even biomarkers and Alzheimer's, even some of the research being shown with mold too, causing early onset. There's a lot of discussion around that. People getting Alzheimer's early onset, 50s, 60s, based on being exposed to different molds, which I think is really interesting too.
Yeah, and again, when we talk about ApoE4, what's interesting about ApoE4 is essentially as these lipid and these fats, as the fat accumulates in your brain cells, and it's specifically in astrocytes, which are structural brain cells. They're in the immune response, but they're more structural than they are like a trash, a garbage man like the microglia. They drive neuroinflammation they also exacerbate your tau pathology. So they actually damage neurons over time. It is, what's interesting about it, again, is when you think about it being a buildup of fat, lifestyle interventions are one of the things that can help to not prevent it, but manage it. So things like the Mediterranean diet, lower fat diets, and of course, consistent exercise. It's also something that, it's a higher risk by population. Caucasians tend to have a higher risk than African populations. But I think the highest risk is actually in Asian populations. So very interesting how these genetic components have developed over time. But again, understanding that it comes back to how our brain cells process and work with their own metabolism and how we can counter that with things as simple as diet or exercise. Now, you can test for it, which is a good or a bad if you depending on whether you want to know early on. Again, in my mind, the good thing is that this is not something that necessarily means, an early onset diagnosis is really scary, of course. A late onset diagnosis, there's an element of we're all going to have some decline with age. It's good to be aware of what might be coming down the road, but you can be aware in how you factor in your own lifestyle to support management as long as possible.
Yeah, you're right. It's also coming out of the MCI, right? This mild cognitive impairment too, that people kind of form before this Alzheimer's happens. And just what happens a lot of times, people say, okay, I've got MCI, mild cognitive impairment. Now what? What all can I do? And I think that's the exciting thing. Part of this podcast, part of what we're seeing in brain health is now we have solutions to some of these unmet needs, and we have some answers, and we're identifying some awareness and education to be able to help. And I think there's just so much buzz on not only Alzheimer's, but I always talk about MS, with ALS, with Parkinson's. To be able to help these people with these neurodegenerative diseases is fascinating.
I'm really curious to follow up that question with both of you. with I've heard from several of the quote unquote renowned people in the brain health space that a keto diet is really beneficial for someone who has or is developing or is late stage in the Alzheimer's world. And what I just heard from Ramona, which baffles me, is that it's a buildup of fats in the brain that's causing this thing to be triggered. And so I would love to hear you guys talk about that. What seems to me, who, I might be sitting out here in left field on this one and not picking it up, but it sounds like a bit of a conundrum where there's this focus on a high fat diet, but there's also this focus on a Mediterranean low fat diet. And that can be very confusing for someone who is trying to follow along with how to best take care of their brain if they're in that situation. Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Dan.
Yeah, no, fair question, Colin. I think I'm a huge proponent of the Mediterranean diet. That's kind of one way that I lean. I think with the keto diet, it's really interesting. I think one thing from a biochemical standpoint that I always learned early on in medical schools, you never want to be in a low energy state, right? Things can happen if your body is in a complete low energy state. So I often wonder with some of the keto diets like that, is your body in that low energy state and what's actually occurring? But I will say with intermittent fasting, one could say, well, you're in a low energy state, but things are really good happening with intermittent fasting by not eating right, as your body's kind of naturally kind of recovering on itself. So to really answer your question, I'm a huge proponent of the Mediterranean diet. Ramona, you may have different answers around the keto diet. Mediterranean is usually the way that I kind of go with more of that plant-based diet. I think that's a really good solution. But I think if the keto diet is working for patients and they really like it, seeing good results and they're feeling overall better, I think that's something we're trying as well.
I have a couple thoughts. For one, I think the Mediterranean diet is the best diet there is. It's not only is it delicious, I'm just going to say that, but in terms of what you're putting into your body, it is wildly healthy. And you are taking in fats, but they're the right kind of fats. So they're more omega-3 fatty acids like fish, oils, those types of fats your body processes better. That's the good fat, is a good way to say it. Ketone diets, ketogenic diets for ApoE4, I would not say that that's a good move because that's a high fat, low carb, right? That's not really going to help that situation of this fat accumulation. However, there are some really interesting cognitive dysfunctions that ketogenic diets are extremely good for people who have seizures, epilepsy. Ketogenic diet is uniquely beneficial to those populations. So it really depends on what you're working with. But if you do, in the context of this conversation, I would say something that's more along the Mediterranean diet is just going to be a much, much better option. Also, there is, I believe, again, because of the fat accumulation, there's higher cholesterol in someone who has an ApoE4 carrier gene. So again, Mediterranean diet is going to help to decrease inflammation, to help to decrease cholesterol. Things that have fiber, antioxidants, and healthy fats, again, not just your omega-3s, but like avocados, olive oil, that's the way to go.
Got it. Yeah, I appreciate you guys clarifying that. It's a confusing world, brain health is. And, I just sounded like Yoda a little bit in the words and how I just arranged them, but to be able to answer questions like that is so necessary, and what it really does for people when they have that clarity, it provides them with the agency that they need to move forward. And that's really going back a couple segments when I was talking about the value of testing. I think it's just so important to know what you need specifically, because there are so many things out there that could be good for you but could also be detrimental or just not really helpful. So by going through a process of better understanding yourself, you can then really move forward with the right path and guidance so that you get to the result that you're hoping for. So thank you for that. And to close, if someone is listening and is supercharged on, man, I'm going to start really taking care of my brain today, Ramona, I'll ask you first. what is one simple habit you'd have them start immediately after this show ends?
Hydration. Electrolytes, hydration. No, I mean it. Being hydrated, having your the right nutrients for your cells to function. I mean, if there's just one thing you're going to do, drink your electrolytes.
I feel drastically different and drastically better when I drink enough water during the day than compared to when I don't. And I notice it, like I'm foggy and tired when I don't. And it's just really interesting. So Dr. Dan, I'll propose this question to you as well. Let's say
Collin, may I say one more thing? The water, yes, but electrolytes specifically, because our neuronal signaling requires calcium, sodium, potassium, all of those things to function. So if we don't have the right electrolyte balance, it's, water, yes, hydration from that aspect, but it's both. The electrolytes they make your brain work.
Really valuable as well. So Dr. Dan, someone hears me say, you've been listening to Brain Innovation Network, and the show closes after the final clip. What is one thing that they should do right away?
I think they should take care of the mitochondrial density, go for a brisk walk, get into that zone 2.
I love that. So we got movement and hydration, specifically hitting those electrolytes, specifically hitting zone 2. Thanks everybody for listening. If you've been enjoying the show, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a review, drop a comment, and share this with someone who might benefit. And if part 1 got you thinking, we're hoping that part 2 gets you moving and hydrating. See you next time. You've been listening to Hello Brain, presented by Brain Innovation Network.